Hello, welcome back to the Richardson Lectures on the challenges of resource management. This time we'll be talking about the changing demand for food in the UK. We'll look to identify where some of our food comes from in the UK, look at the benefits and problems of the global food market, and compare some recent strategies of food production in the UK. Now, the UK does actually have a lot of land still allocated for farming. However, much of this isn't very intensive and therefore not that productive, such as hill sheep farming, where large areas of land are used for a relatively small number of animals. And actually, we don't currently have the capacity in the UK to feed the growing population. And as a result, we now rely on importing much of our food. Currently, around 40% of our food is actually imported. And as well as importing food to meet demand, there are some other reasons why we also import food. Firstly, the UK climate means we cannot grow certain foods all year round. A good example is strawberries, something that's so quintessentially English that we traditionally would have only eaten them in the summer months when we could grow them, but now we can access them all year round as we import them. And also, as a result of decades of migration and globalisation, gradually new foods have arrived in the UK and become increasingly popular. Here's one good example, it's certainly one of my favourite foods, a curry. A lot of the ingredients needed are imported from abroad, and because the demand for them, these ingredients is throughout the year, we import these foods throughout the year. So we'll take a look at some examples of where some food products come from to reach the UK. I'm going to look at that on a flow line map. So this is a map with arrows on that show movement of something. In this case, it's going to be food types. So some examples for the UK, we've got bananas coming from Central America and Costa Rica. We've got asparagus from Peru, sugar from Brazil, tea from India, our strawberries in the winter months anyway coming from Spain, and lamb all the way from New Zealand. Now, with the exception of New Zealand there is a general trend here that actually much of these foods are coming from the tropical parts of the world. And there's a reason for that. It's because we can't grow or produce these foods very well in our country because of the climate, so we're importing them from places where these foods can be produced. Now, this has led to the creation of a global food market. Much of the food you access from the supermarkets now is coming from places abroad, and there's advantages and disadvantages of this. Firstly, by importing food, it ensures that we can prevent the risk of food shortages, particularly if we have a poor harvest in the country. We can rely on getting that food from abroad. By having that global market means we can now access foods that would at certain times of year anyway be unavailable. And also importing foods from poorer countries means that we can get cheaper prices for the customers in our supermarkets. Bit of a subjective advantage, that one, really. Certainly good for the individual shopper, but not really supporting the farmers abroad. There are also some disadvantages of the global food market. So the fact that the food is not as fresh because it's travelled often thousands of miles to reach the UK. Deforestation is taking place in poorer countries so that they can actually produce food. So a good example here from the Amazon, where large areas of rainforest have been cleared in order for these cattle ranches to develop, providing beef for all over the world. And also that extensive travel, food miles we call them, to get our food to us means that we're using lots of fuel, burning lots of fossil fuels, and therefore contributing ultimately towards climate change. So another alternative is to shop locally and support local food markets instead of the larger supermarkets. And there are some key benefits of using local food markets. Firstly, it's probably the food's going to last longer because it's fresher, and also as a result we'll probably have more vitamins and even taste better. It's travelled significantly less food miles if it's only being produced locally, and therefore we're reducing that carbon footprint, those CO2 emissions as a result of transporting food. And also there's an economic benefit in actually keeping money in the local economy and supporting local farmers. So we'll now look at some recent trends in UK farming, and there's two key strategies that are being used to help us reduce the need of imports and/or reduce the environmental impact of farming, and that is agribusinesses and organic farming. So agribusinesses, also known as intensive farming, involves high inputs. Lots of money and machinery goes into that farming. And alongside the money and machinery is high use of chemicals, things such as fertilisers, where we're putting nutrient into the soils to enrich the soils for a better harvest, better growth, but also pesticides, which are used to kill pests, things such as insects, which would ultimately eat your crop and damage the crop and therefore reduce the amount produced. And as a result of these two factors, the yields the amount of food produced on agribusinesses is high. They produce a lot of food, and as a result of that, we see improved profits, a very profitable type of farming. So the advantages of agribusinesses are that we've got high yields, it's a high food producer, it can produce food in areas that are not naturally that productive. If you've got poor quality soils not good for growing, by putting artificial fertilisers on the land, we can make that land suitable for growing and therefore produce more food. And because of the bulk production of food, it also means that we can keep the food prices down. However, because of it's very machine heavy, few people are employed, so it does little support the local economy in terms of jobs. There are obviously some significant negative impacts on the environment, with that chemical runoff getting into the rivers, into the watercourses, and upsetting the local ecosystems. And unfortunately, there are also animal welfare issues, and the ways in which animals are kept is not always to the best of standards. So the alternative, or one key alternative, is organic farming. That involves significantly lower inputs, less use of machinery, and certainly no chemicals used on the land. And as a result of that, the yields, the amount of food produced, is lower. So these farms are producing less food. Instead, they're focused on reducing the environmental impacts of farming and also improving the standard of living for the animals. So some of the advantages are that we're supporting the local economy by employing people. There's minimal environmental impact because we haven't got chemicals getting into our soils or running off into our watercourses, and the animals have a significantly better quality of life on organic farms. Some of the problems though, it's much less productive farming, and as a result less food is produced. There's an increased chance of damaged crops from pests, again affecting the yield. It's very hard work because of the lower machine use, and as a result of all that, the food prices become more expensive. So which of these do I think is the best? Well, I think organic farming is ultimately the best type of farming. The lower impacts on the environment, the better standards of animal welfare, it's hard to argue against that type of farming. However, because of the lower yields being produced with organic farming and the higher price in supermarkets, meaning some families may not be able to afford the organic produce, ultimately we're still going to rely on some of the intensive farming in order to meet our needs and provide enough food for the country. So I'll now finish off by looking at a few exam questions around the UK food part of the specification. So the first question here is a 1 marker. We've been given a figure. It says study figure 10, a diagram showing the average number of food miles travelled for 3 products in the UK. And what we can see is we've got bananas, strawberries and oranges, and we've got the distances they're travelling, their food miles. And the question says by approximately how many times is the average food mile for bananas greater than that for strawberries? And we've been given some multiple choice answers. Well, the best way to do that is to take this figure, 5,523, which is how far the bananas are travelling, and divide it by each of the options we've been given. So if we divide by 4, we get 1,380, by 5, 1,104, by 6, 920, and by 7, 789. So we can clearly see that 920 is the closest to our target number of 907 miles for strawberries. So on average, bananas are travelling 6 times as many miles as the strawberries, so the answer here is C. The next question is a 2 marker. It's a knowledge question. It says how does increasing food miles lead to a larger carbon footprint, for 2 marks. 2 marker like this, we're after 1 developed point. So first mark for some basic idea that increasing food miles means the need for more transport. Second mark for developing that and saying that, well, that's going to lead to an increased use of fuel, and that's going to lead to increased levels of pollution or carbon emissions. Developing the point to get the second mark. And finally, we've got a 6 mark question here. It says, to what extent is it preferable to source food locally in the UK rather than import from abroad? 6 marks. So, of course, this answer needs some good knowledge and explained knowledge about the issues around sourcing food locally versus the arguments about importing food. And because it's a to what extent question, we do need to have an area of judgment, we need to have an opinion in order to actually answer this question. So really we're after 2 or 3 well-explained arguments about importing food versus local food production. We could say local food's good because of lower food miles and therefore carbon footprint, supporting local farmers, better quality or tastier produce, and even less packaging involved. Or we could argue that importing food is also good because it supplies food grown in warmer climates all year round and it's often cheaper. So a couple of those Probably really two arguments why local's good, one argument why importing's good, explained, and then a clear opinion in a conclusion saying which you think is the best and why. Okay, that's it for this video. Next time we'll be looking at water resources in the UK.